So my name is Nick, and I am here to talk about how to run a high-functioning software team. This is obviously going to be a highly opinionated talk, and the opinions are going to be mine, based on my experience and perspectives, but reasonable people can disagree with what I'm about to say. My goal is not necessarily that you're going to follow to the letter every single suggestion I have, but more to get people thinking about what works and what doesn't, and to get people caring about making their teams better. Also, any anecdote that I tell, I will fudge the details slightly to protect the anonymity of the innocent, or not so innocent, as the case may be. So first, a bit about me. My name is Nick, and I'm a tech lead at the United States Digital Service, which is a group of people helping the US government be more effective with its most critical tech projects that are user-facing. So that's for American citizens, immigrants, people trying to visit the US, etc. One of the projects I worked on there was this tool at the IRS, which is the American Tax Service, to let people log in and see their own information. And this was an interesting team situation because there were a whole bunch of different people working on it across a whole bunch of different functions. And so it was a challenge to get everyone on the same page and get everyone talking to each other as we launched a brand new tech stack across all levels of what we were doing. I also did this project with the Department of Defense to help a NATO mission in Afghanistan. This was an interesting project because some people on our team were in Washington, D.C., and other people were in Afghanistan. So we had interesting time zone issues, and when you're working out of a war zone, there are other interesting team dynamic issues that come up and challenges, so that was a good learning experience. And finally, this is the project I work now. This is the Department of Veterans Affairs, which serves America's veterans when they're done serving in the military. And this is an internal tool to help reduce the 10-year backlog of benefits processing. So some people who've earned benefits, it takes up to 10 years to give them those benefits. And this has been an interesting project because we have a whole bunch of different contracting companies and federal employees, and we're all trying to make one culture and community of people that can work together, even though they come from very diverse backgrounds. And prior to that, I worked or interned at these companies. So what we are going to talk about first is why this matters at all. Second is sort of a general philosophy for having a high-functioning team. Then we'll go into some specific practices like Standup and Retro and my recommendations for how to do them well. Then we'll do high-level team practices like onboarding a new person and how that can be done effectively. And then a bit of management advice. A lot of people in tech can end up in a management position they didn't necessarily ask for, and so I'm hoping to help out with that a little bit. So first off, why do we care? Well, I believe that there is a difference between high and low functioning software teams, and that it's not an accident if teams work well or not. I have seen small teams of people that produce more working software than anyone would think possible, and I have seen massive teams of people fail to produce anything. I have seen teams that become lifelong friends and invite each other to their weddings, and I have seen teams that tear themselves apart with drama and have half the people rage quit. So there's a big range of options here, and I want to help people have the better types of teams. And the question is, do you want to be intentional about your team's culture? This is something that takes work just like other aspects of what you do, and it doesn't happen for free unless you're extraordinarily lucky. So a bit about my philosophy for what makes a good team. I believe that trust is the most important thing. This is a sticker from the US Digital Service. When people say funny things, we put them on stickers and hand them out. And this was one of my colleagues who had the experience of being given incredible powers to do all sorts of things in certain areas, whereas in other areas, he was incredibly limited and no one trusted him to do anything. And related to this concept of trust is the idea of psychological safety. Google did a study of a lot of their teams, and they concluded that the number one predictive factor on whether or not a team was going to be effective was psychological safety, which is the idea that I feel comfortable around my teammates. I am willing to take a risk. I am willing to say, hey, you know, I screwed up. This was my bug. The downtime was my fault. And, you know, we're not all trying to get each other fired. We have a baseline level of respect. If you have that, then many other problems become surmountable. And if you don't have that, then it's almost impossible to do anything else. So even when I strongly disagree with my colleagues about something, which, you know, many software engineers are very opinionated, I try really hard not to make people think that I think they're idiots, but that we're having a respectful disagreement. And speaking of that, another thing that I believe is that context matters for the way you do things, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I've had the experience of people joining a new team and seeing that things are done differently and saying, well, this isn't the way that it was at my last company, so obviously it's wrong. Let's change all of this. And if I don't trust that my colleagues who were there before me had reasons for setting things up the way they did, I probably shouldn't have accepted the job offer in the first place, since evidently I don't think they're capable of making up their mind about something. You know, there are different styles that work for different people in different situations, and it's important to not be dogmatic about things. Working with technology in the US government, there are a lot of problems, and this has really given me some perspective on things. I'm a perfectionist, and I can get fairly fussy about things, so I would get into debates with people at my last company about what style of retro was best. And now that I'm working in the government, I think that there are much bigger issues to be concerned with, and I just try to let some of the little things go. Another thing I believe is really important is assuming positive intent. A lot of the communication we do is over text, over GitHub or Slack or email, and when you don't have those nonverbal cues, it's very easy to be offended by what someone said or think they're trying to be aggressive when they're not. So I want to always start from a place of assuming that everyone wants to be on a good team together. And this is much easier if you actually like your teammates as a person, as people, which is why social and team building events are good uses of company resources. Your boss might not want to send all the engineers off into the woods to go camping for 2 days because then no code will be written. But in the long term, that pays off when you have social cohesion and people are more likely to assume positive intent of each other. I believe that building the right it is more important than building it right. And this is also, I think, from Google. And basically the idea behind this is you can have the most beautiful piece of software in the world, but if it doesn't solve a problem for anyone, it doesn't really matter that you built it. And you can also have a software that's basically a disaster with terrible user experience, but if it solves a problem for people, they will put up with it. So I don't know how much Craigslist is used internationally. It's pretty popular in the US. I think it's a complete disaster, but it's still very popular because they got the product design so right. So some of the things I'm going to suggest later are about making sure that we're building things right. Making sure that we're building the right thing and being a little less concerned with, are we building it right? Are we using the most fashionable, latest framework? Because at a certain point of software engineering competence, most apps are fairly straightforward to build. It's like, okay, we need a back end, we need a front end, we need to connect the two. Like, after a while, a certain category of things is pretty straightforward, but the question of what we need to build is still there. So the thing that I am looking for as we try to scale up a team is low-cost coordination. So when you have 2 people, it's easy to just ping back and forth on Slack all day and be on the same page. But when you have more people, there are exponentially more connections to maintain to keep people in agreement. And the question is, how can we add more people without this exponential growth choking out our ability to actually write code? So that's the purpose of a process. And when we have a process, it doesn't automatically mean that we're being bureaucratic. It's, is this allowing us to coordinate in a larger group of people? And one example of this is Paul Graham's idea of the maker's schedule versus the manager's schedule, where the maker, or someone who writes code, does design, does product design, will want to spend hours of time focusing on a single project, whereas managers are likely to be happy having a bunch of meetings and context switching more. So one example here is how can we combine these two schedules in a way that is not going to destroy either person's working style. And that requires some thoughtfulness. So my preferred style, and this is more towards my idiosyncrasies, but I like a high communication but low touch approach. So what that means is I want to be really explicit about what the status of all the work is, but I don't want to be bothering people all the time. So if we're working off of GitHub issues, for instance, I will put a lot of effort into labeling things so that anyone can look at the status and know what's going on, and my teammates can know, what code reviews are ready to look at, what bugs do we have. But I don't want to be constantly pinging them on Slack, and I don't want them to be pinging me. So we're still communicating, but we are also able to have those long, uninterrupted blocks of work. I also strongly believe that focusing on few things at a time is better than taking on a lot of work all at once. Studies have made it very clear that even if people think they can multitask, they really can't. I've worked with one person who defied that, but everyone else just does a worse job, including myself. And finally, I believe in results over compliance. And this is a thing that can come up in organizations where you have some people who aren't quite as strong with their technical backgrounds doing things like security checks or accessibility or performance, where they don't really understand what it means for an app to be secure. They just know if it meets a checkbox, a list of checkboxes or not. And I think it's always important that we focus on the actual problem we're trying to solve and not any written policy per se. So next we'll talk about a few specific workflow practices and how we can do them most effectively. A really important part of software development is the code review. And the code review is a relationship between the reviewer and the reviewee. And there are things that both people can do to do a good job. The most important thing for the reviewer to do is to review from the outside in. And that's a phrase that I got from some of my friends at a contracting company, Nava. The idea is you want to start with the most fundamental issues and then only go to the more nitpicky things after you've established the fundamental issues are correct. And this gets back to my idea about building the right it. So the first thing we want to check is, are we solving the right problem? And if we're not even solving the right problem, it doesn't matter what the style is or if the logic is correct. And an example, I have been guilty of this many times. For instance, let's say that I'm doing a review, and the first comment I leave is use a different syntax. I'm like, please use the fat arrow function. And the second comment I leave is, we don't need this function at all. So it's a complete waste of time for me to say this first thing, and especially if I say it, wait for the reviewer to make, or the reviewee to make the change and then give it back to me, and then I tell them, by the way, throw away all that work. It's a waste of my time and it's a waste of the reviewer's time, reviewee. I also believe that people should write properly in whatever language your team is using to communicate. If the reviewee is giving me their code to look at, I want to be respectful of the time they've put in, and one way I show that respect is writing, fluent English with fully compatible, full grammar. Obviously, if English is not someone's first language, then that's totally understandable. But like, if I can speak English, then I should do it. Also, one sort of trap with code reviews that I've fallen into when I try to go too quickly is essentially being a glorified linter, where I'm not really deeply understanding the code or what's going on. I just look for mechanical things that I can complain about that are only slightly outside the bounds of what our lint rules do. And this is not a particularly good use of anyone's time. Another thing I try to avoid doing, but a mistake I've made when I've been trying to do too much, is the drive-by code review, where I don't have time to look at something fully, but I just cruise up in GitHub, throw down a bunch of comments, and then run away and never engage with the review again. This is also not particularly respectful of the reviewee. If I don't have time to help someone carry something all the way through, then unless I have a really important specific comment, I try to just avoid engaging at all. And there are also things that the reviewee can do. The biggest one is being an active participant in the process and not just passively waiting for the reviewer to point out all the problems in my code. The reviewer is someone who is more experienced than me, or at least is better in this area of the code base, and so I want to use this opportunity to learn from them. One example of this is applying comments across the entire pull request. So if someone tells me, your indentation is wrong here, this isn't meeting our rules, well, I should go through my entire pull request and make that fix instead of waiting for the reviewer to point out every single spot where I made an error. It's also important to make sure the code works, which I am a little bit surprised, but this does happen where people will send reviews that just don't work at all. I've certainly made this mistake in the past, but it's not respectful of the reviewer's time. If I can't take 30 seconds to validate that my code works, then it's not ready for them to review. I actually like to just self-review the entire diff before I send it to someone, and I'm often able to catch a lot of my own mistakes just by checking my own work. On a different note, I believe that task estimation is a waste of time. I was on a team previously where we spent a lot of time with our games like planning poker and planning bingo and all that stuff and arguing about whether things were a 2 or 4 or an 8. And one day, someone did an analysis where they found there was basically no correlation between how long we thought a task would take and how long it actually took. So on that day, we stopped doing task estimation, and I have never regretted it in the intervening years. What we did instead was just trying to have each task be an equivalent size. And we didn't worry too much about what that size was, but just as long as things were consistent, that gave us the predictability we were looking for of knowing when things would get done. And actually, my team's best period of predictable throughput, where we were getting, setting high commitments and meeting them, was when we simply said, we will do 10 tickets every 2 weeks, and didn't worry about the sizes. Stand-up is a fact of life for many teams. And the most important thing with stand-up is to set the stage for doing work and not actually do the work. The idea is to identify blockers and to see what meetings you might need to have with people or sync-ups, and not to solve problems in that meeting because it's very short and it's unlikely that everyone in the team needs to be in on it. So 2 examples of a stand-up status. The bad one is where you're sharing a lot of detail that's maybe useful for when you're having a one-on-one pair programming session, but is just not useful for the whole team. The good model is the one where you're having specific call-outs to different people, like, we should sync up after this meeting, and you should also know about this for what you're working on. That way you're making the best use of the whole team's time. I also believe that you should actually stand during stand-up. There are some teams that don't do this. There's one team that I worked with that had a 37-person stand-up that lasted 45 minutes every single day. And I'm highly confident that the people in this conference call were not standing. If they were, that might have been a bit of a clue that 45 minutes is an absurd length of time to be doing a stand-up, and it had grown into something else. I also believe it's valuable to actually meet synchronously. There are Slack bots where people can just post their status every day, but I think there's value in, if nothing else, being able to look your teammates in the eye once a day and just see how they're feeling, get like an emotional pulse of the team. Sometimes you will have a colleague who was not able to get to sleep last night, and then they woke up and their dog vomited everywhere, and they got in a fight with their partner, and now they're in a super bad mood. And it's a really bad day for them to discover that stuffed horse mask that you've left under their desk. Not that I know anyone who would do something like that. So it's useful to know the emotional pulse of your teammates. When do you need to back off a little bit, and when can you be more normal? It's also important to have a driver to avoid sort of the no you go time wastes. If you only have 10 to 15 minutes, you need to just be as efficient as possible. And I don't believe that stand-up is a useful way to sync with other teams. This is how that 37-person stand-up got started, when you had people from other teams who wanted to know what the original team was doing, and they just started showing up. There are a couple reasons for this. One is that I believe that stand-up should be a safe space for your team to talk about what's going on. When you're communicating to other teams, you might wish to present a more unified front or sort of frame things differently, but you want to be able to be totally honest in your own stand-up. And the other is that when you have people from a whole bunch of different teams, it's really easy for the conversation to get sidetracked, and that's why the stand-up grew to be 45 minutes in this malignant case. There's one analogy that I'm not sure how widespread it is, the pigs versus the chickens at stand-up. This is like if you have the discipline to do it and you must invite people from other teams. The idea is that if you're making breakfast, pigs have skin in the game because they become bacon, whereas chickens produce eggs and they are not having to be killed to make the breakfast. So the pigs are the people talking who are on the team, and the chickens are just the bystanders who don't say anything. Now that I say that analogy out loud, that actually sounds pretty weird. So I'm curious if anyone else has ever heard that, or that was just the one person in my last company. But this requires a fair amount of discipline to have people actually not talk. With tickets, the power of a good ticket is that someone else can do the work. There was a time when I would essentially use tickets as my personal, reminder to-do list, which would help me remember to do something later, but it wouldn't help anyone else on the team. And once upon a time, I had written a slightly better ticket, and someone else did it, and I was like, this is amazing. Now I have mind control abilities. Like, I was able to get other work done on the team by just taking 10 minutes to write a good ticket. So this is an example of a ticket that I knew how to solve the problem we were facing, but not every engineer on the team did. The task took, I'd say, 2 to 3 hours. It took me 10 minutes to do this ticket. I was able to offload this to someone who was a little more junior, who could then do this, and then I could focus on other things that only I knew how to do. So the whole team became more effective because I took the time to write a ticket that makes sense. When you do postmortems, it's important that they're blameless. And this gets back again to the psychological safety idea that Google had. You don't want to finger point and say, you screwed this up. You want to just try to diagnose the root cause of why something happened. And if you have that psychological safety, it's easier to admit when you did do something wrong, as opposed to trying to protect yourself and deflect blame to others, which will make it harder for you to figure out what actually went wrong. And the way to do this is to focus on the conditions that made the error likely, not on the specific mistake that was made. So there's a story of an engineer at a large software company that ran a command and accidentally deprovisioned half of the servers for a core piece of infrastructure. And this person showed up to the postmortem ready to be fired. They're like, this was just a terrible mistake, and I totally understand if you let me go. But the people running the postmortem said, no, we're not going to fire you. If we did that, we'd just have to fire the next person who made this mistake in 6 months, and then we'd have to backfill both of you. The problem is that the tool allows you to delete half of our servers without asking if you were sure first. So it's important to focus on the conditions that caused the problem and not the one person who was unlucky enough to step into that problem on that particular day. Having a tech lead is important on your team to keep in mind the general picture of what people are building and make sure that everyone is going in the same direction. And it's also important that the tech lead has the authority to break ties. Engineers can often be highly opinionated and can butt heads indefinitely on a pull request. Eventually, someone just needs to make a decision so you can ship some code and move on. And the tech lead is a person who can do that. Sometimes you also just need to be a referee in personal relationships. I was on a team once with 2 people who were both very smart, but had very different working styles and thought processes and couldn't really communicate with each other. And for whatever reason, I could understand both of them. So I was sort of like a marriage counselor. I would go to one person, ask them what they thought, and then explain that to the other person in ways they could understand, and then sort of take that back and forth. is a somewhat unusual situation, but sometimes you need someone who can sort of play that mediating role. Retrospectives, I think, are very important. All of this stuff of having a good team is not something that you just set once and forget and then it is good easily. It's something you have to iterate on and work on like anything else. So if you're going to be on a team with someone for more than a few months, I recommend taking the time to talk about how to be better. It is important to celebrate successes and not just talk about what can be improved. This is certainly a thing that I've struggled with, where to me it's like, well, the successes are obvious, but I want to talk about our screw-ups. But it is important to celebrate successes so that people don't feel like it's just constant negativity. And I also believe it's important to avoid anonymous passive aggression. And this is basically when people will submit things anonymously to the retro that they don't actually want to talk about. So for example, let's say we have our retro board that people anonymously submitted things to, and we have 3 items. Standup takes too long, pair programming is fake news, deploys to prod are too risky. Well, the first and the third are things that we can have a conversation about. But the second one doesn't actually mean anything, it's just negativity. And if at the stand-up we said, okay, let's go down the list, who wrote this, number 2, let's talk about it. If no one raises their hand, then really all that's being accomplished is passive aggression. We're not actually able to solve any problems. So a better way of writing this would be to actually describe the problem that you're having, like pair programming doesn't happen as often as it should. And if a person is not willing to speak up and have that conversation, then I think that they just shouldn't write that card in the first place. Many teams will have testers who work on the team with them. And there are 2 ways that I've seen this done. One is where the tester will validate every ticket at the ticket level. So developers work on tickets, they send them over to the tester. If the ticket is broken in some way, the tester will send it back. If the ticket is good, then the tester will put it in a done category. And the other option is feature level, where testers aren't responsible for validating individual tickets, but groups of tickets. And each of these has pros and cons. The ticket level is good for more junior engineers. If you have a lower level of trust that people can just do the basic steps of the ticket well, then it makes sense to have someone checking up on each detail. It's also helpful for more junior testers. It's easy to just look at a ticket and validate, does this do the one thing it's supposed to do or not? It's harder to look at a whole feature and figure out what's supposed to be going on. It's also helpful in high-risk situations. So if you are writing code for something that goes into outer space or into someone's body, like a medical device, on my team, we are writing code that's doing this benefit processing, and when people don't get these benefits who need it, they sometimes go homeless, they sometimes die waiting in line. So a single bug can ruin someone's life, literally, so we have a very high-risk situation. So that's why we like the ticket level testing. And it's also very easy to implement. You can just, it's easy to set up a policy or a workflow where the tester looks at every ticket. But the cons are that it's easy to miss the big picture because no one's looking at what's going on, and this is to what I was saying about building the right it. You don't necessarily have anyone looking at it. You can also duplicate work. If I'm doing a code review, then I'm going to make sure that the ticket works, and then the tester is essentially doing the same thing. And it can also distort throughput analysis. So what I mean by this is, let's say that we have a feature with 8 tickets, and we can't launch it to the users until they're all done. And we coded the 8 tickets, and one of them came back with a bug in it. So if we're asking how much work we got done this week, a ticket level analysis says we did 7 tickets, but a feature level analysis says we did 0 features because we didn't actually ship anything to the user. So that can be potentially confusing. On the feature level, the pro is that it's more empowering for senior engineers and testers. People generally like having more autonomy and being asked to take on bigger problems, and it's more fun to say, here's a whole collection of things, can you validate that it works, as opposed to these very specific requests. Again, it's focused more on building the right it. And it's conducive to more types of testing, where you might have developers writing unit and end-to-end tests, and then your testers can write integration tests. The problems, though, are that the feature boundaries can be arbitrary. Sometimes you'll have tickets that don't fit in any one feature, and then it's just sort of awkward. It's also more overhead to spend time thinking about what the groups should be. And you can miss details because you don't have anyone looking at that lower level. And speaking of throughput analysis, another option is whether you're going to do Kanban or fixed sprints. So let's say that this is a graph of how much work your team is getting done every day. When you're doing fixed sprints, you're going to group these into the sprint. And when you have outlier days, like what we see here, where not much got done and then a lot got done, what side of the sprint boundary that falls on is going to affect how things look. But sometimes these outliers can be completely arbitrary. Like, it just so happened that we all started a ticket on this day and we all closed a ticket on this day. So it looks like we were incredibly lazy this day and we got a ton done this day, but that's just not really correct. And if you divide that into sprints, then you might have people saying, well, what happened this week? Like, why didn't we get anything done? That's why I prefer the Kanban model, where you're just continuously moving tickets through a priority queue, and then you look at the moving average. And that way you are not susceptible to having those arbitrary boundaries make it look like there's something going on in your data that's just not happening. So now we'll talk about a few higher level team practices. I believe that one of the most important aspects of onboarding is sharing team norms. It's easy to think about onboarding as being things like, how do you get your developer environment set up, and how do I get into the building every day, set up your email. But I believe that onboarding is really about someone entering your team, entering the community, and trying to figure out, how do I fit into this society? And people who are on their first tech job, so like new grads or people who just came out of a boot camp, need even more help. So for instance, I think one of the most important onboarding questions are things like, what do people do for lunch? And I've seen situations where someone asks this, and then the answer they get is, people go eat whenever they want. And while that may be true, that we don't have like a fixed lunch hour that the factory manager lets us have, it's also not helpful if I'm trying to eat lunch with you so we can be on a team together. So a better answer is one that's actionable, where you're telling the person, this is what our team tends to do, and this is how you can become a part of it. Similarly, questions like, what should I wear to the holiday party? I've seen a lot of answers like, wear whatever makes you comfortable. Well, for me at least, this makes me the least comfortable because I just want to know what the norms are, and then I'll make a decision accordingly. So a better answer is to tell you, what people are going to do, and then people can make up their own minds. This is the actual description of the US Digital Service holiday party dress code. We do have people who dress up as giant eagles instead of wearing a suit, because when you're on Team USA, that is a thing that some people like to do. Another question that I will often ask is like, what time do people get to the office? And the classic answer is, as long as you're getting your work done, we don't care, which is a thing we like to say in tech because we want to feel very progressive, but that's obviously not true. If I got all my work done, but I was working from midnight to 8 a.m. every day, it would be a huge pain because no one could meet with me and I'd never be online. So I would recommend giving an answer that actually describes when people show up, even if you do still have flexibility around that. Another challenge is having remote workers. A good remote working relationship requires extra effort. There are things that you get for free when you're all working in the same physical space that you're not going to get when you're working remotely. And so it takes extra work to recreate that and to build that trust. So one practice that I like is explicitly signing on and off for the day. When I'm in the office, it is easy to see when I'm at my desk and when I'm not, and you can get a sense of when I show up in the morning and when I go home. And this is helpful not necessarily because you want to micromanage me and check up on me, but it's just nice to know, like, okay, I don't need to get back to your email right now because I know you're not going to be on until tomorrow morning. I recommend visiting the office, when it is possible, to try to build up some of those relationships. Humans are still social animals, and there's some level of trust and comfort with other people that you just can't get over the internet. I also recommend participating in office chatter. It's hard, like for me, when I go to the office, I just want to get my work done and then go home. I don't really like to be distracted, particularly when you're remote and you don't have like the water cooler chat or like the going to lunchtime chat, you're not going to have that. But I recommend explicitly having time to just talk about random things with your teammates. Because when that code review starts to get a little heated or the post-mortem starts to get concerning because there were big downtime problems, you want to have that baseline level of we like each other and we are both good people, because that can really soften out a contentious situation. It's also important to get a good mic and camera. If people are primarily perceiving you through your webcam, then it should be a good webcam so that that experience is smooth. If your microphone is really crappy and every time people hear you, they're like straining and they can't really understand what you're saying, people will just subconsciously take you less seriously or like not want to trust what you're saying. But many companies will reimburse you to get AV equipment for your home office. And finally, I recommend producing work frequently, even if it's smaller chunks of work. In the office, again, if you see someone working at their desk and they have their editor open, you can tell that they're doing some work. Remotely, if no one hears from me for 3 days, they might start to wonder like what I'm up to. So when I'm working remotely, I like to have something at least once a day of, hey, I finished this pull request, I coded up this ticket, I deployed this thing to production, or even I'm halfway done with this ticket, but here's where I'm at, just so that people can know that I'm still active and engaged. And as someone who's in the office, there are things you can do to support remote teammates. One is having conversations in written channels as much as possible so that they can participate. And I like talking with my voice, but if I'll have a conversation with someone in person, I will then go into Slack or GitHub and post a summary so that remote people can also be aware and chime in if they want. It's also important to make people feel welcome when they visit the office. When I see a remote teammate from out of town in the office, I will go up to them first thing in the morning, shake their hand, say, welcome to the city. When, for the week that they're there, we'll have happy hours planned or team dinners or team lunches or whatever. You want to make the person feel welcome when they show up. And one thing you could do is get an office webcam. My team had a drop cam set up for a while because we felt like everyone on the team can see when we're at lunch and when we're in a meeting and when we're at our desks, except for the person who's working remotely. So if we just set up a webcam that's always watching us, then they'll know. And we set this up, and we all felt great about it. And then we suggested to our neighboring team, how about you set this up? And they were like, that is incredibly creepy. We will never do that. So, you can decide for yourself if this makes sense, but it can be a nice way to build some ambient sense of familiarity. And then there are things that both people can do to work well together. One is to make heavy use of GIFs and screenshots. There is very simple free software that will make GIFs. The thing that you really want to do is be able to just point to your screen and say, this isn't working, here's the bug. Obviously, you can't do that remotely, so the more detail you can have in tickets, the better. There are also tools like screen sharing or Screen Hero, which lets you just take control of someone else's machine. That can be useful for this. This is also where assuming positive intent becomes super important if you're communicating over chat a lot. One thing that I will do is I'll throw in a bunch of completely superfluous emojis to try to soften what I'm saying. I think this makes it better. Maybe some people think that I'm like being facetious, but if I say like, hey, did you look at my pull request? If you don't see that I'm sort of smiling and have friendly body language when I say that, you could think that I'm annoyed with you. So I will have the smiley face emoji, which obviously will remove any tension. And I also advise being mindful of crucial conversations. So when you do have a hard conversation to have with someone, whether it's about their performance or a post-mortem that's really tricky or a big team issue, I recommend having that over video chat or in person or some richer channel than trying to hash things out over email or Slack, for instance. All right, and so finally, a little bit about managing other people specifically. This is going to be some things that I wish people had told me when I first became responsible for managing other people. In tech, we do this hilarious thing where we assume that if you're good at programming a computer, you will also be good at helping people do their jobs. And often these are two completely different skill sets. So I'm hoping that by giving some advice that I wish someone had told me, I can help smooth some of that out. One thing is that people will talk to you differently. Even if you still have close relationships with people, if you have some sort of a formal relationship of them reporting to you, there are just some things they're not going to be comfortable telling you. And there are some companies where all the engineers will go out to a bar on Friday night, and like after midnight, that's when the real business gets done of like they start sharing all the information about what's really going on at the company. And as an engineering manager, you might just never have access to that. So this makes it really important to, when someone does talk to you, listen. Maybe don't always take things at face value that people are saying. You have to read between the lines a little bit. It's also important to get buy-in when you're rolling things out that are difficult, and not to take your engineers for granted. If the job market for engineers is fairly competitive right now, if the engineers on your team are good, then they can generally easily find jobs somewhere else. So when you're doing something like saying no one can take PTO for the next 60 days, which I have seen happen, you should be careful to roll it out in such a way that you're acknowledging that it's painful for them and getting them bought in, and not just assuming, oh, well, because I said it, they're definitely going to do it. I've also seen that the scariest problems are the ones that people refuse to talk about. And you'll have situations where, say, all the engineers go out to the bar and they're like, we have problems with this company, but the senior management isn't talking about it because either they're in denial or they don't know. And that becomes really scary because either of those two scenarios don't bode well for the problem being solved. But when a problem seems really bad, but leadership is able to acknowledge it and say, okay, here's where we're going wrong, here's what we're going to do to fix it, then people will start to feel better. I also believe in leading by example and not just having people do things because I tell them to. For instance, when we rolled out PagerDuty on my team and we had to ask people to start carrying a pager outside of normal business hours, I wrote up on the whiteboard a list of people who were going to be on this rotation, and I put my name at the top of the list. I was the first person I wrote down. And the point of that was to demonstrate to people, I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself. And finally, I believe that leadership is more than being an assembly line inspector, than presiding over the deploying of code and the closing of tickets and the merging of pull requests. If you can go for something a little bigger picture, I think that's really helpful. And an example anecdote of this, so the team I work on, we are getting people their benefits that they've earned through military service, and these can be a life-altering decision for people. Some of them are unable to work because they've been injured in combat, and this is what will allow them to continue having a normal life. And as part of the process, people will come in and do a hearing with judges at our office to determine if they deserve the benefits or not. And one day when I was coming into work, I saw two women who had just gone through security and for their hearing. And the receptionist said, okay, it's 9:30 a.m. right now. At 1 o'clock, you'll have your hearing. So you can go get lunch, get a coffee right across the street at Starbucks, whatever. And the women said, oh, no, that's fine. We're going to sit here and wait. And they sat down in the lobby. So this thing was so important to them, they were unwilling to go across the street for 4 hours. They just wanted to sit there and be sure they were going to be ready. And when I witnessed that, it really brought home the work that we're doing. And it's easy when you're working in an environment like the US government that's full of legacy code and unstable systems and really tough things to work with to lose sight of the human picture. So I then went up to my team, and at Standup, I shared this anecdote with them, and with the goal of inspiring them to, to care about what we're doing, and not just to be depressed by how difficult our environment is on a day-to-day basis. So if you have mission-driven work or there's some higher purpose that you can point people to, I think that's really powerful. And that was another strong predictive factor that Google found in their study, was when people think the work they're doing is important, then they do a much better job. So now hopefully you are equipped to be on or run a high-functioning software team. Thank you guys for listening.